Let's finish up the basics of truth tables here. So we're going to start talking about section 3.4. And in 3.4, oops, that was section 3.3, we're going to talk about conditionals and biconditionals. Okay, so while that is loading up, um, conditionals. Conditionals are the ones that you got to be careful of. Okay, just like when we were talking about how there's like so many ways to write conditionals, the order of conditionals and truth tables is super important. Okay, so conditionals, they're what we know about them is they are only false when the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. And again, you can find this information on page 155. So when we deal with conditionals, when I do truth tables, you will see me put the antecedent, ant abbreviation, and con abbreviation over the columns that I'm dealing with because I need to know the order. I have to look at them in a certain way. I need to look at them from the antecedent to the consequent because the only way I can recognize a false answer is if the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. Remember, the statement before the arrow is the antecedent. The statement after the arrow is the consequent. So that's super important. Before the arrow is the antecedent. After the arrow is the consequent. Okay? So if you're looking at this, true to true is always true. True to false, because this was the antecedent and this was the consequent, the answer is false. This is why I mark who is the antecedent, who is the consequent. Because if I'm not paying any attention to order, I could easily say, oh, true to false, that's false, or that's false here, and that's incorrect. So you got to be careful. You got to make sure you know who the antecedent and who the consequent are, because the order for conditionals is important. Okay, this is the one where you got to watch out for that. When it comes to negations, ands, ors, and biconditionals, you can look at any column in whatever order you want. Okay, but when it's conditionals, you need to really look at it from the antecedent column to the consequent column. Okay, so this is false to true, and that's a true statement, and false to false is a true statement. Okay, and conditionals are only false when the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. Biconditionals. Okay. Biconditional is only true when both statements have the same truth values. So again, on page 160, you can see this information. So right here, true, true, see how both of these are the same truth values? That's a true statement. And then down here, false, false. Both of these are the same truth value statement. Okay, they're both false. That's a true statement. So biconditionals are only true when both have the same truth value. Okay, so true, true is true. False, false is true. Okay. And then last but not least, down here, implication, because they might ask you a question about an implication. An implication means that you have to be a conditional. In the final truth value column, you have to be dealing with a conditional, the arrow. That is the final column, and I'll show you more of this here in a second. When the final column is a conditional, and it is a tautology, so there's two pieces to this. Your final column has to be the conditional you're dealing with, and it must be a tautology, true all the way through. Then it's an implication. Okay? But if your final column, if you're dealing with a negation, an or a biconditional in the final column, then you're not worried about an implication. Okay? Implications only happen when you're dealing with a conditional statement that is a tautology. If the conditional statement is a tautology, then you can look at an implication. But if that final column is not a conditional, if it's an and, a negation, an or a biconditional, do not worry about implications. Okay? And tautology and self-contradiction are the same thing in this unit. Okay, so we're just adding the last few symbols, the arrow and the double arrow, and dealing with truth tables. That's all 3.4 is about. So let's jump in. Let's take a look at some of these. All right. So as I said, conditionals, if-thens. If P, then Q is normally how they're written, but I want you to think about it as the antecedent, then the consequent. If the antecedent, then the consequent. And as I said, the antecedent comes before the arrow, the consequent comes after the arrow. Because conditionals, it's very important on the order. Okay? So remember, conditionals are only false when the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. So let's take a look at some truth tables. Let's do this. There's not a lot to this, okay? It's all the same kind of problems that you saw before, okay? So, again, let's talk about Mr. Armstrong's order of operations. Let's put that back in here to remind you, okay? Armstrong's order of operations, truth table style. Okay. All right. So let's get started again. So again, remember the first thing you deal with? Parentheses. Second thing you deal with? Negations. The third one you will deal with? Ands and ors. Let's grab that information right up here. So ands and ors. Where are you? There you are. So there's the or. There's the and. Okay. And then the fourth are conditionals. And the fifth are the biconditionals. So let's put that information in here real quick. Move this kind of to the middle like this. Kind of make it look a little bit pretty. So conditional. And the biconditional is fifth. Okay. And there you go. So those are the same order of operations that we had now from the previous section. Oops. Just now in 3.3, you only went from 1 to 3. Now in 3.4, you could go from 1 to 5. Okay? There we go. Grouped it all together. So let's tackle this problem. So do I have parentheses? Absolutely. Inside my parentheses, there is no conditional. There are no ands and ors. Or sorry, inside my parentheses, there's no negation. There's no and ors, but it is a conditional. So my first parenthesis, I'm going to take care of the conditional. Okay? Or in other words, this is actually going to complete our parenthesis. Now, when I look at this, when I tackle conditionals, I need to know who is the P. That's the antecedent. So I'm going to put ant above it. The Q, since it's after the arrow, that is the consequent. So I'm going to put con above the Q. I think it's super important to mark that. I think it's going to help you a lot. And we're going to use these two columns to get my parenthesis column. Okay? So remember, conditionals are only false when the antecedent is true, the consequent is false. So I'm going from true to false. That's true. I'm going from true to true. That's true. I'm going from true to false. That's the false case because this is the antecedent, this is the consequent, and the antecedent is true, the consequent is false. I don't like how that looks right up there. I know, random of me. Consequent. There we go. So that's the false case. Oops. I'm going from false to true. That's true. And false to false. That is true. So I've dealt with my parenthesis. Now I start back over. Do I have a negation on the outside? Absolutely. We're going to now negate Q. Okay? So we're going to take the Q column and negate it. I no longer think of these as antecedent and consequence anymore. That was only for this column. So this is now just column P. This is now just column Q. Okay? They don't keep those labels throughout the whole thing. So negate Q. So that becomes false, true, false, true. And now the last piece, do I have ands and ors? Absolutely. And after this, there's nothing else to do because we've taken care of the rest of the symbols. They're not there. So we're going to take care of the parenthesis and put an and with the negate Q. So again, there's a reason why we made these columns, because we're going to use them now. If you make columns and do not use them, I don't know why you made them then. Okay, every column should be used. So remember, ands only true when both are true. So true and false, that's false. False and true, that's false. True and false, that's false. True and true is true. So again, they could ask you the same questions. What are the conditions for a true value in the end? So here's the true value. Here were the conditions. P is false and Q is false. They could ask you, is this a tautology, self-contradiction, or neither? So hopefully you would say neither because it's a mixture. It was almost a self-contradiction. Okay? They could ask you if this is an implication. Now let me talk to you about that. Remember I said we look at the final column. What is it that we dealt with in the final column? We dealt with an and. So since this final column is all about an and, you will not talk about implications because this is not a conditional statement. Even though we had a conditional right there, in the end, it's not a conditional statement. It was all an and statement. Okay? So you will not worry about whether this is an implication or not. If this final column, you're dealing with an arrow, that's when you can think about an implication. So if this was an arrow, would I call this an implication? No. Because remember, to be an implication, you had to be all true. You had to be a tautology. Okay? So there's kind of like the implication information that I was talking about. Okay? Because this is an and, we don't worry about implications here. All right? Go ahead and give this one a shot. Okay? Notice you have 3 statements here. We talked about the default setting for 3 statements earlier in 3.3. So go ahead, give this one a shot, and go. Okay, so I know it's a little off up here, but I'm not willing to go back and fix it right now. So remember that the default setting looks like this. True, 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 false, 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 and then true, true, false, false, true, true, false, false, true, false, true, false, true, false, true, false. And remember I showed you that this really is like a pattern, that if I just took off the first column, look, that's the default setting for 2 statements. True, true, false, false, true, false, true, false. And it repeats down here. All we did was add on a first column of true, 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 false, 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 false. Okay? So this is as big as what your truth tables are going to get. You're not going to have to worry about 4 statements. That's just crazy. So this is as big as what they get. So just go through your Mr. Armstrong order of operations. Let's start with purple this time. So first things first, do I have parentheses? Absolutely. They're right here. So we start working inside these parentheses. Do I have a negation? Yep. So we're going to negate Q first. So there's just going to be a lot of true falses in this one. So we're going to negate Q. So we use this column to help us out right here. So true becomes false. True becomes false, false becomes true, false becomes true, true becomes false, true becomes false, false becomes true, false becomes true. So there's the negation of Q. Now, do we have any ands or ors in here? Nope. Do I have a conditional? Absolutely. So we're going to deal with the conditional right here. So the negate Q is the antecedent, because it is in front of the arrow. So I'm going to put ant on negate Q. The P that comes after the arrow, that's the consequent. Okay? So we've got negate Q, arrow, P. That's our new column. And again, negate Q is the antecedent and P is a consequent. So I'm going to be looking at the purple column to my first column when I make my decisions here on the sign. Okay? Remember, conditionals are only false when the antecedent is true, the consequent is false. Okay? So here we're going from false to true. That's a true statement. We're going from false to true. That's a true statement. Because you have to look at it from the antecedent to the consequent. If you didn't look at it that way, you would have said this was false and this was false because you would have been going from true to false, and that's incorrect. It's always the antecedent to the consequent. Watch the order. So we got true to true. Well, that's true. We got true to true. That's true. We've got false to false. That is true. We've got false to false. That is true. We've got true to false. That's the false case. And true to false, that's another false case. So there is the conditional with its truth values for this, going from the antecedent to the consequent. And conditionals are only false when the antecedent is true, the consequent is false. All right, so that takes care of the parenthesis. Now we work outside. So do I have any negations outside? Absolutely. So we're going to take care of negate R. So all we're going to do is take this column for R and switch the signs. So it goes false, true, false, true, false, true, false, true. And now you only have one symbol left to deal with, and that is the and. Okay? So we're going to negate R and negate Q, arrow, P, parenthesis. So that's our last column. So we're going to use our red column and our green column to help us out. So again, every column has been used. Okay? Ands are only true when both are true. So true, false, false. True, true is true. True, false, false. True, true is true. True, false, false. True, true is true. False, false, false. False, true, false. And there's the final answers. So again, we could ask some questions. You know, I could ask, what are the conditions for false statements? So you can come in here and be like, well, if P is true and Q is true, that's a false statement. If P is true, Q is false, that's a false statement. If P is false, Q is true, that ends up being a false statement. Oh, sorry. There's actually 3 statements here. I don't know why I'm only circling 2. Silly me. So if P is true, Q is true, R is true, that's a false statement. If P is true, Q is false, R is true, that is a false statement. If P is true or false, Q is true, R is true, that's a false statement. And then the last 2, P false, Q false, R true is false. And if all 3 statements were false, you end up with a false answer. Okay? I could ask you, is this tautology, self-contradiction, or neither? Hopefully you would say neither. Do I have to worry about an implication on this? Hopefully you say no, because in the final column, what were we dealing with? An and. Implications deal with conditionals, not ands. Okay? Yeah. There's the biggest kind of truth table you're going to have to deal with. All right? I think I've got one more. Yep. So go ahead, try this. This one actually has a biconditional. Okay, remember biconditionals are only true if they have both the same truth value. So true, true is true. False, false is true. And go. Okay, so here we go. Dealing with your parentheses. Do we have parentheses? Absolutely. In my parentheses, do I have negations? No. Do I got and or? No. Do I have conditional? No, not inside the parenthesis. So in the parenthesis, we're actually going to be dealing with P, biconditional, Q. Okay? So we're going to use these two columns to help us answer. And again, because it's a biconditional, you don't have to worry about antecedent and consequent. We just want to know what is the truth value. And again, remember, biconditionals are only true if both of them have the same truth value. So true is true. True false is false. False true is false. False false is true. There's your biconditional. And that completes the parenthesis. Now, we're going to work outside. Do I have any negations out here? No. Do I have any ands and ors? No. I do have a conditional. So we have the parenthesis P, biconditional Q, arrow P. So what this means is the parenthesis, because it is before the arrow, this guy is the antecedent. The P that is after the arrow, that is the consequent. Okay? So we're using these two columns here to help us out. And make sure, again, that you look at it from the antecedent to the consequent. And for conditionals, only false when the antecedent is true, consequent is false. All right. So antecedent is true, consequent is true. So that's a true statement. Antecedent is false, consequent is true. That is a true statement. Antecedent is false, consequent is false. That is a true statement. Antecedent is true, consequent is false. That's a false statement. And there's the final answers. Okay? So again, we could go through. What are the conditions for a false answer? Hopefully you say when P is false and Q is false, I get a false answer. Is this a self-contradiction, a tautology? Neither? Hopefully you said neither, because again, it's a mixture. It was almost a tautology if this would have just been true. Can I worry about but implications on this one? Absolutely. The final table right here, the final column, was all about a conditional statement. So in this one, I could ask you, is this an implication? And hopefully you said no, because in order to be an implication, all this would have had to have been true, a tautology. So this is not an implication. This is when, this is what I was talking about. When this final column over here is all about the arrow, the conditional, that's when you can think implications. And that's it. That's 3-4. That's what you're going to run into. You got this. Okay? So after this, now we're just going to start talking about, how can we use this information? And that'll come up the following week. Good luck. Have fun.